and welcome to the Craft Cannabis Summit. If this is your first session that you are tuning into, then a big warm welcome to you. In this session, we are going to be talking all about medicinal cannabis. And so we're going to be talking CBD, health and wellness. We're going to be talking about dosing, about education, and all of that good stuff. I'm your host for this session. My name is Dr. Carmen James. And before we go any further, I want to say a very special thank you to our generous sponsors, Westgrow. Westgrow is the official tourism, trade, and investment promotion agency for Cape Town and the Western Cape. The agency is the first point of contact for foreign traders, buyers, local exporters, and investors wishing to take advantage of the unlimited business potential in the region. I also want to say a big thank you to our headline sponsors, Drace Garden and Grow One Africa, and all the other sponsors who have supported this cannabis event. And I want to just also say that we are broadcasting live from the Chiba Cannabis Academy, which is Africa's first cannabis campus outside of Johannesburg, and it opens in April. So if you want to attend the open day, it's happening this Saturday, and you can register at chibaafrica.com. Now we're going to kick off this session with an introduction to cannabis for health and wellness, and I'm going to be speaking with Kelly McHugh. Kelly McHugh is a cannabis activist and the author of the book At Home with Cannabis. In 2012, Kelly's life changed forever when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Welcome, Kelly. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your story with us. You can just say hello to everybody and tell us about how your story began.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to just thank Chiba Africa for hosting this wonderful event and for allowing me the chance to share my story here. So as you said, in 2012 is when my story begins. I was 34 years old. I was a new mother. I was extremely overweight, unfit. I had bad eating habits, and I was chronically depressed. And then I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I shouldn't have been surprised, but at 34 years of age, it was a big shock. So I decided not to go the conventional route of chemo, radiation, and surgery, and instead I chose to go the natural route. But with somebody with chronic depression, this was terrifying because I honestly just did not have a lot of faith in my own self-discipline. Up until that point, I had failed in anything that I tried to put my mind to. So I decided I would simply forge ahead, do my research, and see what I could find. And that's when I came across the video from Rick Simpson, which was Run from the Cure. And in that video, he speaks about how he helped his friends, and most importantly, he showed how to make the oil. So because this was 2012, so there was no buying it anywhere, I knew I would have to make it myself. But fortunately, cannabis was cheap and easy to come by, and making the FICO oil was actually extremely simple. However, the dosing, that was a whole other story.
Yes, and it still is another story. We're going to be talking a little bit more about dosing a little bit later. But it seems like, things were really not going that well for you to begin with, and then all of a sudden you get this knock out of nowhere that just kind of puts the cherry on the cake, so to speak. And so tell us a little bit more about your journey to discovering how to make your own oils, and take us along your healing journey with you.
Absolutely. So once I had the oil, it was a case of figuring out how to work with the dosage. The first time I took way too much, and I was still extremely high the next day. And this was a problem because I needed to look after my daughter during the day. So ultimately what I decided to do was to only take it at night. And that way I would sleep through the worst of the effects, and I'd still be able to function during the day. And this is what worked best for me. And then in theory, all I had to do was keep increasing my dose every 3 to 4 days, as I felt able to. But the reality of it is that taking that much cannabis oil and increasing your dose so rapidly is very heavy going. You feel very tired, you feel very drained, but you also sleep very well. So it's a bit of a trade-off. So it is a bit of a trade-off. But after about 4 weeks, where I had only added the oil, I had not made any other changes in my life. And I started to notice a real shift in my attitude. I started to feel a lot more optimistic. I was more motivated to research and do more, try and implement more lifestyle changes. I started yoga. I started looking at my diet, and I started experimenting with fasting. And in fact, my focus and motivation became so strong the longer I was on the cannabis oil, that I eventually was able to do a 40-day water fast, so 40 days straight, where I only had water and the cannabis oil, and I was still preparing meals for my family. So
wow.
That to me is the real power of cannabis, is that it helps you to actually, it empowers you to help yourself.
Wow.
And so after 8 months, I was able to completely heal myself of the breast cancer. I had lost 20 kilograms, and I had found a way to successfully manage the symptoms of depression. So that was amazing. But I continued taking the oil to keep managing the depression, and I then coupled that with therapy and self-help health tools. And every 6 months, I would come off, check in on myself, see how I was doing. And then inevitably about 2 weeks later, I would start to flounder, I would start to feel overwhelmed, and I would go back on the oil. But I am very proud to report that 6 months ago, I went off the oil and I have not felt the need to go back on. So, wow. Yes.
That's
so
my incredible story. Wow. Kelly, I think that for a lot of people who don't know about cannabis and wellness, and, you know, I think a lot of us have misconceptions about cannabis and we come with our own preconceived ideas. One of the things that people say is that when you use cannabis, it can actually make you less motivated and lazy. And so what's coming through for me from what you're saying is that you had the opposite experience.
Well, a lot of the symptoms that you get are obviously in relation to what's going on in life. But there is a big difference between smoking it and ingesting it over a long period of time, and people do need to understand that. With the ingesting, once you get used to your dose and you don't feel tired anymore, you actually get a lot of energy back.
That is incredible. And so tell us a little bit more about your book in the last few minutes that we have here with you.
So my book is basically just a little bit about my story and some of the people that I've worked with, but it's mainly a guide for people to be able to do this on their own. You know, I set about on my journey with even less information than is in that book. And I just feel that if we could give people all the information in one place in a very easy to digest way, then more people will feel confident to take this journey. And so, yes, if you're looking to empower yourself, I really sincerely encourage you to explore cannabis. My book is available at any of the local bookstores, or you can get it online as well.
Amazing. And you said something here that was very interesting to me. It depends how you take it, I suppose. But you said something along the lines of it depends on how you ingest the information. And so we are going to be talking about edibles and that kind of thing a little bit later. But thank you so much, Kelly, for coming here and for sharing your journey and your story with us. It is incredibly empowering to hear these reports back from patients like yourself, who have gone through a healing journey and who are living proof that this is an actual method of healing yourself. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And any words of encouragement that you have for anybody who is facing a chronic illness or perhaps just wanting to improve their health overall. Do you have any last words for somebody who's maybe watching and considering, maybe they're on the fence, anything that you can kind of suggest to them to encourage them from your story?
Absolutely. You know, we use the word journey a lot, and I think it kind of gets overused, but this really is a journey. And my advice to people really is to learn to listen to yourself. Cannabis will help you to do that. And if you are using cannabis with intention, you are going to get the results you are looking for. But it does start with listening to yourself and being responsible.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I think that it is important, Kelly, one of the things that you mentioned here, which is so important when people are looking to use cannabis, especially cannabis for health and wellness, is that only relying on the cannabis is not good enough. Kelly shared with us about how she started changing her diet and doing things like yoga and meditation and all these stress relieving practices that are so important for all of us to consider doing. And so thank you so much, Kelly, for being here with us. We really appreciate you. And we are incredibly grateful for your recovery, and thank you so much for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your summit.
Yay! Okay, so we're going to bring a few guests on, and these are fantastic experts in the field of health and wellness as it pertains to cannabis. And so I look forward to getting my panel on the call with me in a few moments. But some of the topics that we are going to be discussing today are CBD and how we can actually use it to improve our overall health and well-being. And so first up, I've got Dr. Jake, who's coming in here. I think he dipped in and out. Dr. Jake, hey, welcome.
Hey.
If you could just introduce yourself to the audience and just tell us a little bit about you. And maybe you could also just share with us how you found your way to cannabis and wellness.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. That's always a great way to intro. My name is Jake Felice. I am a U.S.-based naturopathic physician. I have been doing cannabis consults and evaluations now for about 10 years. Areas of interest for me really, at this point in time, involve the endocannabinoid system and autoimmunity, and also the botanical paradigm and how to teach that to clinicians who are very well trained in classic pharmacology. The way that I learned about cannabis from my patients. I had 2 patients in a row one day, about 10 or 11 years ago, come in, and they, the first patient had taken herself off of 2 medications, and I said, how did you do that? And she said marijuana, which didn't really register with my brain because that word still has some stigma attached to it, at least here in the US. But the very next patient, coincidentally, had removed themselves from the exact same medication. It was a benzodiazepine. And I asked him, okay, what'd you do? And he said medical cannabis. And it just clicked in my mind. And I did a little research that night, and I was astounded. I feel that cannabis has an immense amount to offer the medical establishment, whether it be through assistance with pain, with the opiate crisis. I think it can be very effective for anxiety, short-term sleep. It can be very good for. And also, let's remember that this plant is also produces food and fiber for industry, and we can actually feed the entire planet with hemp seeds from cannabis. It represents a perfect protein with a perfect lipid profile, which is extremely unusual in the plant world. So I see this plant as a multifactorial assistance to humans. I think it offers us a number of ways to move forward, both medically and in the fields of industry. And it's extremely exciting for me, and I'm super happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jake Felice, as you guys heard it. And next up, we have Dr. Carissa Saunderson. Thank you so much for being here. And Doc, if you'll just introduce yourself to everybody listening today, tell us a little bit about who you are, and then how did you end up, how did you find yourself in cannabis and health?
Hi, Carmen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm a medically trained doctor from Cape Town. I discovered cannabis in 2016, so about 5 years ago, when I started my own health journey. I was diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer and started taking medical cannabis seriously. I wasn't sort of unfamiliar with, the talk about it being good for maybe chemo, maybe pain relief, which is what I started using. With a 5-year survival of 15% for ovarian cancer, that was 5 years ago, I think cannabis gave me the key to be part of that 15% club, actually, which, I'm incredibly grateful to be here. Areas that I found it useful was definitely for the post-chemo nausea and vomiting, definitely for pain, for sleep, just general well-being. And I think cannabis opened me up to the idea of health rather than treating illness. And since then, I've sort of been reading. I've actually attended a course by Sharon. I've done the Medical Marijuana 411 course. It's actually HPCSA registered, which is really awesome. And it's afforded me the opportunity to talk to my patients openly about the benefits of cannabis, which is amazing. I think we overlook it so often, mostly because it's not in our syllabus at med school. I think I remember like 1 or 2 lines mentioned about, the endocannabinoid system. So to discover this whole new world of cannabis has been absolutely eye-opening. So in primary healthcare, where I'm working now, it's something I'm very passionate about, and not just about, treating something, but also promoting health so that when we are unwell, we've got the systems in place to try and fight whatever it is. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with us. You really do have a fascinating health journey, and I think it would be an inspiration for anybody here on the call who's listening. And finally, my last guest that I have with me today, we have Sharon Price. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And Sharon, if you'll just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in the health and cannabis space. Sharon, I think your mic is muted.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. So yeah, I got into this industry quite by accident. I had no interest in the medical history whatsoever. I studied art. I have a degree in art. But 14 years ago, I watched my sister. She got a brain tumor. It was a really aggressive brain tumor. And of course, during this time, I started having a look at various ways to support and help her. I discovered the Rick Simpson thing on the internet, and I was furious. I went to visit a scientist friend of mine and explained to him how these potheads were giving people a false sense of hope. We'd been through so much trauma. Can you close the door? With my sister. Long story short, he sent me packing, asked me to please come back when I had studied the endocannabinoid system, and we could then have an intelligent conversation, which I did go along and start studying it. I was very influenced by Raphael Mechoulam, spoke to quite a few medical doctors that I was friends with, and discovered at that stage there were only 63 cannabinoids that were discovered then. And I then launched a career in this. I went to study. I studied with Dr. Richard Kutela as a traditional healer. I then studied further with another 2 institutions to actually learn about herbs. Subsequently, I've spent the last 14 years treating patients for cannabis and also training medical doctors. It's been a journey. Yeah.
It certainly sounds like it. Thank you so much for being here. So welcome to everybody in the panel, and thank you guys for availing your time and your expertise. And so we really want to squeeze out of you guys as much as we can throughout the rest of this session. And so all 3 of you have mentioned in your introductions the endocannabinoid system. Now, I think that we cannot go any further in the session until we clarify what exactly is the endocannabinoid system, because I think for a lot of people who are joining the session, maybe they know, but there may be a few people who actually have never heard of the endocannabinoid system. And I think for all of us to be on the same page, it would be helpful to maybe start there. So anyone can go, just to give us a brief description of what the endocannabinoid system is. Dr. Jake?
Well, the endocannabinoid system we have to ask not only what it is, but where is it and why is it? It's kind of like the internet of the body. It evolved over 600 million years ago when single-celled organisms in the ocean got together to form bodies. And having a body presents biologic challenges. How do you make a body? How do cells differentiate? Where do they go? And how do they protect themselves not only from the environment, but also how do they monitor within the body itself changes that are going on and make adjustments? It is involved in every single major system in the body: respiratory system, cardiovascular, nervous system, etc. And it is the largest receptor system in the human nervous system. What is a receptor? It's kind of like a little molecule on the outside of the cell that catches other molecules as they go on by. In the days of COVID, we all know about the little spikes on the virus. They will land on a cell receptor. Likewise, our body makes its own endocannabinoid molecules. And anytime there is stress in any given system, the endocannabinoid system responds. One of the ways that it responds is it can make more receptors. So it is a dynamic response system that is monitoring both information from the outside world and the inside world, and it is an interface between the water environment and the lipid or fat environment of our cells. So in many ways, it's like the internet of our body. And as we know from experience, if there are technical issues with the internet, stuff doesn't work. Likewise, if the internet of our body is not working super well, there can be problems ranging from very mild to severe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jake, for that. And I think that it's important for us, you mentioned about receptors. I think an easy way for people who are listening to think about it is almost like a lock and a key, right? So you've got these locks that are all around your body. And basically, your endocannabinoids inside your body are coming to fit inside those locks. So tell us a little bit about, if we can start to maybe open the discussion to incorporate CBD. So I think a lot of us are seeing CBD on the shelves, and I think everybody and their grandmother is now making CBD oil and selling CBD oil. And I think it can be quite confusing for people who are, going into a health shop and now seeing all these products on the shelves. Firstly, what is CBD and how can we actually use it for our overall health and well-being? And then maybe we can chat a little bit about some of the clinical indications for using CBD. Dr. Saunderson, would you like to go?
Yeah. Sure. So in the plant, all the active compounds, that we find in the trichomes, the cannabinoids, we've got a bunch of them. We've got THC, which is our psychoactive compound. We've got CBD, cannabidiol, and those are the two major cannabinoids. Then we've got the minor cannabinoids, not because they're any less strong or potent, it's just because there's less of them. We've got CBG and CBC and a whole host of them. For different effects that we're studying, especially CBG in inflammatory bowel disease, for argument's sake. So CBD essentially is very similar to a molecule we already have in our body called 2-AG. And this binds to a receptor, our CB2 receptor. And then we've got THC, which is similar to anandamide, which is already in our bodies, which binds to the CB1 receptors, which we can find all around, especially in the nervous system. The CB2 receptors we find in the immune system mostly. And so once, like you explained, with the lock and the key, once these two join, it then opens the door essentially for a whole host of mechanisms. And I think the main thing, with the endocannabinoids is that it maintains homeostasis. So there's a few areas where it's incredibly useful that we found. We've definitely got some studies, especially for pain. It's proven helpful. I can attest, yes, ma'am. And then sleep or insomnia, which is a really big problem. The other Yes, so we know that in certain epileptic conditions, like Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome, it's incredible. And we know also in certain brain tumors. So there's a whole host of uses, especially for CBD and THC, but CBD is the one we are focusing on. And I think we are promoting it as a general wellness supplement, like I was talking about earlier, in terms of health, to try and maintain a balance. So those are the main things, just broadly.
Great. So why would I actually go out and buy a CBD supplement? Like for my general health and wellness, why is it actually going to help me? You mentioned pain, you mentioned that it can help with sleep, but let's say I don't have any of those things. Should I still be taking a CBD supplement? And if so, why? How's it going to help me?
It's hell of a useful because it's a broad anti-inflammatory. And I think, with the conditions of modern day, we've got a lot of reflux, we've got a lot of chronic conditions that are inflammation in the body. And for CBD to try and calm that inflammation, you're sort of attacking a whole host of chronic diseases. So to keep things in check and our systems in balance as an everyday supplement, that's, I think, CBD is the most useful. That answers the question.
Perfect. So I think that for a lot of people, maybe not specifically on this session, I think a lot of the people who are here are enthusiastic about learning about cannabis. But I think for the general population, and unfortunately in medicine in general, I think there's still a lot of misinformation and there's still a lot of hesitancy towards cannabis. And unfortunately, that is because of the way cannabis has been politicized. And, we basically learned about cannabis as a drug of abuse, right? So when it comes to education, I think there's a lot of room for education, not only for the general public, but also for healthcare professionals as well. And so, Sharon, if you'd like to give us your idea, why do you think it is so important, specifically for healthcare professionals, to be educated about the uses of cannabis for their patients?
I think the first time I ever did a talk about cannabis to a large group of medical doctors was at UCT at the Lung Institute. And I found that the doctors were kind of shocked because when I started speaking about lipids and enzymes and these various different things that were in the plant, they really couldn't believe that this was all in the plant. And honestly, after one training session, the first group of doctors that came for a 3-day seminar, there were 20 doctors in the room, life changed. Because the moment they understood, and we're working mainly in the cancer field, so the moment they understood that they could give them one medicine that was an antidepressant, a sleeping thing, an anti-inflammatory, improved appetite, and so on, we replaced literally with a cancer patient almost immediately 5 or 6 traditional medicines. So, I'd like to just go back a little bit, though, if you don't mind, guys, about the CBD. Because there's so much confusion and there's such a CBD hype out there. It's really quite frustrating. People don't understand really what a part plant medicine is, what a full plant extraction is. And most of the CBD stuff that you're seeing on the shelf are part plant medicines made from hemp. Since we've had them on the shelves in South Africa, we've had an influx of patients with huge problems because of taking medicines that didn't have all the components in, or medicines that were made with benzene or made with. So I really think the CBD hype is actually confusing people more than anything else. And they really are getting not as good a medicine as what a full plant extraction is. So we work with both. We work with sativa and CBDs, low full plant extractions in the day. In Sanskrit, it stands for day. And the evening is the more couch lock and the more indica type of medicines with high THC in it. That's what causes homeostasis in the body. You will push the body completely out of homeostasis if you only give them CBD.
So that's a fantastic point, Sharon. And I think that one of the things we wanted to discuss today was the differences between a single extract, a broad spectrum, a full spectrum, because I think a lot of this can be very confusing for a consumer who goes out there and wants to purchase a product, but perhaps is unsure. So maybe if we can just demystify all these very technical terms that maybe some of us take for granted, but are important for patients and just, the public to know when they're going out there and trying to purchase a product. There are a few things that they need to keep in mind. So maybe we can start with those definitions, the differences between an extract, an isolate, broad spectrum, and full spectrum.
Okay.
I'd be happy to take a stab at that. So plants make molecules for a reason. They, and a lot of the times these secondary compounds like CBD are specifically evolutionarily designed by the plants to affect other organisms. For example, with CBD, the plant uses CBD to compete with other plants when it gets washed into the groundwater. It acts on those plants' physiology and enables the cannabis plant to survive. In humans, CBD lands on so many different receptors. It is indirectly affecting cannabinoid receptors. It lands on a different set of receptors called serotonin, which you may have heard of, which is kind of a feel-good neurotransmitter. It's involved with adenosine receptors, things that are called nuclear receptors. So CBD, I once had a patient ask me, this sounds like a magic bullet, and I was like, well, it's actually more of a synergistic shotgun. Just a bit of a segue in very modern approaches to cancer treatment and complex neurodegenerative disorders. Modern medicine is now utilizing the targeting of multiple biochemical pathways to reduce toxicity and increase effectiveness. So the plant is doing that naturally just with the CBD molecule by itself. But we know from studies, lots of studies, that if you just take a single molecule, like if you take, like for example, coffee or tea, if you just take the caffeine out of tea, it has a different biologic effect. Cocaine is the same way. In the indigenous cultures, it's drank as a tea, and it is a mild stimulant. Out of US, I have had an opportunity to try it. It's a better, cleaner than coffee. But as it is refined into powdered cocaine, the medical effects get worse. And as it further refined to crack cocaine, they get even more difficult. So many of our conventional medications are derived from plants, but the further you get from the original plant in terms of the processing, the more harsh the molecule is on the physiology, because it tends to be just attacking one thing rather than a biologic network. So full spectrum and broad spectrum are, I think, not the best terms, but usually full spectrum means the plant has a bunch of different cannabinoids, including THC, which is psychoactive, CBD, and others. Broad spectrum is usually referred to as something that might not have any THC, but might have a bunch of other cannabinoids like CBD, CBN, CBG. The benefit of broad spectrum versus full spectrum, at least in the US, we do a lot of drug testing. There's a lot of police, fire, military, people who drive for a living, airline pilots that don't want THC in their system, not because it's not helpful, but because of drug testing, for example. So I feel my professional opinion is that a little bit of THC can be helpful for most patients. In the US, our hemp is 0.3% THC or less. So a plant with a tiny amount of THC and a bunch of others we're calling full spectrum because it has everything. And then a broad spectrum is something that has almost everything, but usually just has that THC molecule removed. Kind of like if you decaffeinate your coffee, you pull out some of the caffeine from your coffee. So a long explanation, but I think an important one. Both can be, now an isolate is just a single molecule itself. And we see a lot more problems clinically with isolate. An isolate would be just the CBD molecule versus coffee, which has a bunch of different chemicals, or tea, which has caffeine plus L-theanine. When when we give a patient a broad spectrum versus a full spectrum, a large degree is a matter of their choice. I think that the main reason for folks not to use full spectrum versus broad spectrum is that THC can be helpful. Broad spectrum can be useful for many things, but might not be as helpful for sleep. And the single molecule, especially in large doses, is sometimes causing liver function tests to be elevated. That's not necessarily a problem of the CBD itself. It could be, we could chat about that. But the single molecule itself has a lower degree of efficacy. But for example, in a topical, it may be beneficial because it doesn't have that cannabis odor. And, a lot of people are fragrant oriented when it comes to products. So this is the thing about plant medicine. It's very, very fuzzy. And when you are speaking with clinicians about it, they want it to be exactly the same across the board, which makes sense given their paradigm. But when you do that, you limit the ability to utilize other compounds to help individual patients. So it is a very complex topic. Just to highlight, full spectrum with THC, broad spectrum, everything but THC, and isolate just the CBD molecule, nothing else.
Wow, that was an awesome explanation. And I think the thing that stood out for me the most is what you mentioned about the complexity of plant medicine. I think coming from a paradigm where we studied pharmacology and single drugs to manage illnesses, it's a very, very different science that we're talking about when we're speaking about plant medicine.
When in the U.S., our Federal Drug Administration considers plant medicine to be in a different regulatory class than the single molecule drugs because of the inherent differences. The thing about cannabis that's very important to remember is one of the big concerns that traditional medical doctors are really worried about is toxicity. The main areas, cannabis is extremely low toxic unless it is being manufactured unethically or unprofessionally. Somebody had mentioned hexane derivatives. Anyway, I'm getting a little feedback, so I will mute my mic and listen to what the panel might have to say. Thanks, guys.
So thank you very much for that, Dr. Jake. I think that one of the other things that is important for us to understand, and perhaps for users of cannabis products to also get, is that not only do we have cannabinoids inside the plant, but we have a host of other things. And so we may have heard this concept known as the Entourage Effect, right? And so perhaps either Sharon or Dr. Saunderson can just share with us a little bit more about what is the Entourage Effect and why is it so important?
Okay. Go, Carissa.
I'm going to have a stab and then Sharon can fill in the gap. So the amazing thing about cannabis, and we're still discovering more and more compounds, is that it works on so many levels. In the cannabis, the cannabinoids, THC, CBD, and all the others. And then we've got what we call terpenes, which are essentially the aromatic compounds. If you have ever smelled a cannabis plant and that fragrance, it's unique to every plant. And the reason for that is the compound. So we've got things like linalool, which smells like citrus, and we've got beta-caryophyllene, which smells like pepper. And then my favorite, we've got linalool, which is lavender, and we know lavender is sedating. So you can already try and imagine the effect of the plant by just smelling it. So to come back to your point, the entourage effect is like this whole host of gang coming in together and exerting the effect synergistically. And the best way I explain it to my patients is you need even less of, let's say, opiates, because you can use it together with the opiates. 1 + 1 = 3. So the combined effect is actually more than the sum of the parts individually, which is incredible. And we're moving away from, the reductionistic model of medicine where we're breaking everything down, because that's the way that we studied. We studied in isolation, the digestive system, the neurological system, the circulatory system. And cannabis is amazing in that it works on all of them at the same time. And we're starting to look at things as a whole rather than trying to break it down to understand it, which is what I'm happy about. Sharon.
I think that's fantastic. In other words, another way to look at it is, if you speak to Dr. Jake alone, that would be great. If you spoke to Dr. Saunderson alone, that would be great. But if you spoke to all of us together like you're doing today, you get the entourage effect. So thank you so much for that explanation. I think that it is important for us. Say that again. Sorry, Doc.
That was an excellent analogy of all of us here together. I like that.
Exactly. And so we just want to say thank you to all of you who are joining us today. We hope that you're getting some good information from us as a team. We hope that we are sharing with you things that are going to empower you, not only educate you, to take your health and wellness in your own hands. So I think on that point of wellness, and Dr. Carissa mentioned a holistic approach. I think that sometimes we can think that cannabis is a silver bullet, right? So if you have something wrong with you, a dreaded disease, a diagnosis like cancer, for example, or if you just want to improve your health and wellness in general, then you can just, continue life as normal and then just take a bit of cannabis. Everything's going to be okay. But I think that we all would agree, or I at least hope we'd all agree. If you don't agree, please share your opinion. I'd be happy to hear it. But why is it important to think about health holistically? And what are some of the other things that we can do when we're using cannabis to ensure that we are supporting our health and our healing as best we can?
Well, my evolution of thought has really come around to this concept of health. But if you take it back to a clinical situation, usually in medicine, a lot of the times it's pretty straightforward if you're treating one patient with one condition, say they have diabetes, right? And diabetes, interestingly, responds pretty well. We know for first-line therapy, diet and exercise can be very helpful for someone with diabetes. But if you start throwing other conditions in, such as a person with diabetes who has a bad knee, that bad knee might not enable them to exercise well. So the more problems that occur in the physiology at the same time, likely as we age, the harder it is to treat clinically. Trenton, you are on the line, Trenton. I'm sorry, I've got another voice on my thing here. So
I think there's a voice that sounds like Trenton to me. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's fine. So when we use cannabis, if I have a patient that I can find a use for cannabis in any system, it may or may not work for that patient. However, if they're having a respiratory or a cardiovascular issue, it may not help that, but it can help them in other areas, largely by maintaining the health of other systems while we work on the acute or chronic disease. Because we know that from multiple systems, we have so much bench science, we have so much animal data, and an awful lot of randomized control trials now, that you may or may not be able to make the argument that cannabis is effective in MS, multiple sclerosis, but it might help with their spasticity. We do know that, for example, we have studies now with cancer patients showing that for certain types of brain tumors, for example, a 1-to-1 CBD THC can extend life expectancy for an hour or for a year or so compared to the control group. So it offers not only an opportunity to treat the specific medical condition, but also to help the body support that. So I find it wonderful for chronic disease. I find it wonderful for basic pain that might be associated with that, anxiety that might be associated with that, lack of sleep that might be associated with that. And if my patients aren't sleeping, I'm very worried about them. Anyway, I'll let other folks chime in, but I think that's one of the benefits is it can do both holistic and specific.
And I think that you spoke to the properties of the plant, that the plant in and of itself makes different components for different purposes. And so in the same way, when we use cannabis in the body, there are multiple different roles that it can play, not only to help with disease, but also just to support our wellness in general. And so, Sharon, perhaps you can share with us, because I think that there are a lot of different ways that we can consume cannabis. We know that we spoke a little bit about oils. We spoke a bit with Kelly before the session started, and she told us how she learned to make her own oils. And so perhaps you can share with us, what are some of the routes of administration? So how can we actually consume cannabis? You're muted, Sharon. If you'll just unmute for us.
Sure, how's that? Okay, so I've worked over the past few years. I've worked in an unusual manner in that I hold 13 different genetics. So I use certain genetics for certain diseases.
Still hold the video. You're gonna get that.
Oh, we got that voice again.
Oh, there's a voice again. I think it might be the CBD behind the scenes. Sorry about that.
So because I specialize in cancer, I work a lot with THC. THC is the main component when it comes to cancer, when you're treating cancer. And I'm very strict about working with a full plant extraction. So certain terpenes will be directed to certain diseases, i.e. Parkinson's is often related to inflammation in the stomach. So I'm working with cannabinoids and terpenes within the plant for that particular disease. We have different methods if we want to, and again, when I work with seizures, other than Dravet syndrome, I work with THC and high ratios of THC. If I'm working with an elderly person that has a heart problem, I then work in MCTs, encapsulates the THC molecule and the cannabis molecules, and it doesn't give you as much high. I know there's a lot of controversy about suppositories, but we've had multiple cures between a large group of doctors, SASM in particular, if you look at the SASM group, where we're working with suppositories and saturating a person on high THC without it getting to the brain. So that's one way. We still do tiny amounts in the evening, but again, coming back to it's different genetics and different products. For example, breast cancer, again, we're talking high THC CBD, but we work only with 1-to-1 ratios. Any estrogen-driven cancer, we're working with 1-to-1. We've clearly seen how a 4-to-1 or a 7-to-1 will actually make tumors grow. With prostate cancer, we have that problem with testicular cancer and breast cancer. So it's quite complex. And then don't forget that within that full plant extraction, and absolutely full, the black tar that people talk about, we've got amino acids and we've got a load of steroids. We've got vitamin A. We've got, besides all the flavonoids and everything. So there again, it's not simple. A plant to a disease, rather. People are just, there's so much science behind this, and it's one science. It's the same science in Israel and in America and in South Africa. So I think it's just refining it to genetics, to disease. And then another interesting thing, everybody spoke about the entourage effect. If you took a full plant extraction and you put it through a CO2 extractor, if you extracted using CO2, when you mentioned the lock and key from anandamide to THC or any cannabinoid to an endocannabinoid, with a CO2 extraction, it's not a lock and key, it's a screwdriver and a neurotransmitter. So even a simple thing like doing a CO2 extraction is not going to give you the entourage effect. We can go on and talk about different processes. We stick with a really old-fashioned ethanol extraction, and that's really, it's all about genetics and extraction process.
So coming back to dosing, I think it is important because there is a lot of confusion around dosing. And I think that if there's one thing that we've taken from the session is that there's nothing simple about this. And that's why it's important to partner up with professionals who actually can guide you through this process. Because another important point about the endocannabinoid system is that it's unique to each and every one of us. A dose in one person is not necessarily going to be a dose in another person because of the amount of imbalance that may be existing in one person compared to another. And so I know that one of the points of contention perhaps around dosing CBD specifically in South Africa is that we have a cap. So we've got a recommendation that we shouldn't be taking more than 20 milligrams of CBD in a day, which I can see Dr. Jake is like wiping the sweat from his brow. So perhaps from an international perspective, Dr. Jake, if you could shed some light as to how you are going about dosing CBD specifically where you are.
Great question, and everybody asks this question, and you mentioned variability. So I'm going to slow down because I tend to talk really fast. There is so much variability in the dosing. You mentioned it, all of our endocannabinoid systems are different. In fact, my own endocannabinoid system is different now than it will be tomorrow. So even within the same person, it's changing. So let's follow the cannabinoid and plant molecules from the plant to the inside of the physiology where it works, and you will see all of the variability in this medicine. One, the products are all different. So the terpene ratio, the THC and CBD might be the same, but the terpenes might be different, and that's going to behave differently. So the products are different. The delivery methods behave differently. There's advantages to each of them. But an inhalation of a delta-9 THC behaves differently than if you eat it, and that's because our liver makes a chemical change. So the delivery methods are variable. Thirdly, once inside the body, the cannabinoids are lipid soluble. And when most of us, even trained scientists, even medical doctors, when we think of pharmacology, our model, the classic model in conventional pharmacology is a water-soluble IV drug. We inject it and we watch the levels. The cannabinoids are not water-soluble, so they behave more like a lipid-based drug. So there is a variability with which how they stay within the bloodstream. And lastly, the receptor population is different. The receptors, the catcher's mitts, or the lock and the keys, when the endocannabinoid system needs more input, it puts out more receptors. So there can be as much as a 100-fold variability in the receptors that at any given cell. So even a standardized product with a pretty reliable delivery system, such as an oral mucosal or an inhalation, is going to behave differently in every different patient on any given day. That doesn't mean they can't be helped. And we also know that this is a low toxic compound, so we're not likely to be, there's not likely to be harm being caused, and yet there is potential for benefit. So it becomes more like the practice of anesthesia than conventional pharmacology, where the anesthesiologist is giving a medication and monitoring it. But instead of the doctors monitoring it, we have to teach the patients how to monitor themselves, because they're going to have questions, and you can do this as a patient. You can, and the huge benefit of this from an educational perspective is it forces people to pay attention to their health. And oh, I'm not feeling so good today. I had a couple beers last night, and I'm not feeling so good right now. Maybe I shouldn't be doing that anymore. So it makes us focus on our given internal state at any one given time. And yet at the same time, we know from a number of clinical trials, it has efficacy in certain conditions, pain, muscle spasm, neuropathic pain, sleep, etc., and a whole host of other generalized health benefits. So for the person who wants a very square, universally accepted best medicine, best dose, that's not how this works. And I think that's one of the big problems in industry, is that's why the US FDA considers botanicals to be in a separate class of medications. They just behave differently. And luckily, versus 12, 15 years ago when I was in medical school, I don't want to do the math, it might have been longer than that. That's not, we didn't have the evidence of all of these entourage factors that we now have a huge base of good clinical and preclinical data that supports the use of this plant, not only as a general health aid, but also in some very specific conditions that it might directly affect experimentally, and with the potential to help a whole host of other conditions, which may or may not be helpful for any one given person. So it's fuzzy. It's very fuzzy, and a locked-in mindset finds trouble with that. But I think that when you see the science presented well, it makes a whole lot of sense, that holistic approach.
Well, guys, we are running out of time. And if you didn't gain at least one thing from this session, I would be surprised. I just want to say a very special thank you to the awesome panel that we had on this medical cannabis session. I want to say thank you so much to Sharon Price, Dr. Carissa Saunderson, Dr. Jake Felice. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are literally out of time. And once again, a huge thank you to our generous sponsors, Westgrow, who have sponsored this session and made it possible. Westgrow is the official tourism, trade, and investment promotion agency for Cape Town and the Western Cape. And we also want to say a big thank you to Drade's Garden, as well as Grow One Africa, our headline sponsors for the Craft Cannabis Summit, brought to you by Chiba Africa. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us for this session. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and just like that, we have got to go. But I'm sure that you guys learned a lot from this session as much as I did. Thank you so much. Give yourselves a round of applause.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.